Fighting games are great, and part of why they're great is the characters. A big roster full of characters with diverse movesets and playstyles is able to appeal to a vast assortment of players and keeps the viewing experience interesting. And these characters can be put into archetypes, some more general than others, but all for the purpose of helping newer players and watchers understand the game plan that each character is trying to achieve. And in this respect, there are two archetypes that tend to show up more often than others: the Zoner and the Grappler. And generally, Zoners tend to edge out Grapplers in the direct matchup. Now, are these two in every single fighting game? Probably, arguably not. Some games don't lend themselves very well to these, but generally if you squeeze hard enough, you can get characters into these archetypes. But enough about that. Let's explore the Zoner and the Grappler and what makes these two so near universal. To begin with, what makes a character a Zoner? Usually when we think about Zoners, one of two characters come to mind, either Guile or Dhalsim. And because we already spent a whole video talking about Guile here, the Zoner of choice today will be Dhalsim. There are generally two tools that epitomizes a Zoner character: a Fireball, which Dhalsim has, or far-reaching limbs or normals, which Dhalsim also has. Basically, a Zoner is someone that has a tool that allows them to play from long range. Not necessarily full screen, just further away than everyone else. Zoners have these tools, but just knowing you have a tool doesn't really do much for a player by itself. So how do they use them? How does a quote-unquote Zoner play? Or how would they like to play? Fighting games are all about spacing, or where you want to be on the screen compared to your opponent. Universally, there is one common answer. You want to be directly in your opponent's face, with their face on the ground. It doesn't matter what character you play, this is the best place you want to be. You're in their face, threatening your offense, where your opponent is forced to make an immediate decision or face damage, with minimal risk to you. I will admit there are exceptions. If Batman has his dumpster, I think he's pretty happy. And the platform fighter equivalent would be this, where you're edge guarding. But point is, everyone wants to be here. But when you're a Zoner, you have an additional area you want to be at. Here, or here, or here. Pretty much everywhere past here. Most characters want to play at this range, just outside of their buttons and moves, so they can easily walk in and threaten them, or stand their ground without being at threat. And the reason why is, if they get any further from their opponent, they don't really have options anymore. But if a Zoner is in this position, they have their zoning tools, which puts them at a noticeable advantage. The fundamental idea for Zoners is this: get them in a position where you can do things and they can't. Force them into a zone where you have the advantage. And the tools that Zoners have equip them for this situation. Either fireballs that go full screen, which forces your opponent to stop or jump or do something, or fast unreactable limbs that halt one's advance. Dhalsim loves to be from here to here because they can't really contest either your limbs or your fireballs. There isn't a risk-averse way to deal with this. But it is important to remember that just because a character has a fireball doesn't mean that they are a Zoner. Some fireballs either don't go far enough, are too slow, or have way too much recovery in order to be consistently threatening at the proper ranges. Sometimes fireballs are used as pressure tools in offense, or just as pokes, maybe even anti-airs. They don't necessarily need to be used for zoning. And certain characters have better zoning than others. Not all tools are made equal. Zoning tools are usually ones that are not only effective at longer range, but also keep them in these longer ranges. Once a Zoner gets into their effective range, they can stay there until their opponent forces them out of it. And what does a Zoner get once they get here? Sometimes damage, sometimes chip, but above all else, Zoners force your opponent to take a risk. This was a point I ended on in my Fireball video, but I'll bring it up again here. Decision making in fighting games are all about risk-reward, and when a character is here, where both players have access to their options, they can choose to take the risks they want to take. They are in control of their fate. But when a Zoner gets to execute their game plan, suddenly the player is no longer in control of their fate. You can't just play how you want, you have to play around the fireball or the zoning option. That means you have to take risks. More risk for the opponent means less for the Zoner, and this is where their strength comes in. Zoners are able to put pressure on their opponents, and play in a generally risk-averse manner. Sure, jump-ins hurt a whole lot more than anti-airs, but like I said in the fireball video, low chance of actually getting punished with high damage versus high chance of getting punished with low damage. Forcing your opponent to play to your speed does end up frustrating them, which lends its way to making your opponent take more risks. Risks that are in the zoner's favor. A cycle that ends with your opponent with no health left to throw away. But that doesn't mean that zoners need to play this way. Most of the time, zoners have the tools to play and even hold their own at closer ranges. It's just they can, and will, choose to play into this strength of theirs. But characters operate on give and take. If you have an overwhelming strength, you should have a weakness to make up for it. Mark has a giant sword with lots of range, so to make up for it, he has a weak grab. And for zoners, they usually do end up having a downside. There really isn't a universal downside for the whole archetype, and some characters are worse at zoning than others, so I'll just say that zoners generally don't have the biggest damage. They will get in way more stray hits than others, but they don't hit as hard. But that is all just a bit of a nothing burger. So what do zoners lose to? This is a bit anticlimactic, but other zoners. Much like how a sniper gets countered by another sniper, zoner tools are made to interact with other zoner tools. And usually, the better fireball gives one character a big advantage. They also don't like characters with gap closing tools and anti-fireball tools. Characters that leverage their range will have problems when it's forcibly taken away from them. We talked about zoners, so now let's get to the next part, the Grappler. And here, there is no decision to make. One character has always been the quintessential example of a Grappler, and that character has to be Zangief. So what makes a Grappler? I talked about how every character wants to be right here, because here is where they can start to push their offense. Here is where you are the strongest. And for Grapplers, that is also true. You could say it's even more true for them. On top of the offensive tools characters universally have, Grapplers have access to an additional tool, the command grab, a grab that can't be broken and needs to be responded to with a more committal defensive option. If your opponent doesn't respect your command grab, they get command grabbed and eat big damage. But if they do respect it, it opens up your other offensive options. There's no easy option to deal with this. When Geef is in your face right here, it makes sense that you would be afraid. You don't want to eat a spinning piledriver that does this much damage. Zoners aim to frustrate, but grapplers want to instill fear. Throw loops frustrate, but command grabs get you terrified on defense. Zangief has a move, the Borscht Dynamite, specifically designed to catch an opponent jumping. An option in 5 that you generally shouldn't be ever doing. Backdash is just better in these scenarios, but even top players still jump, possibly making a hard read for more damage, but also maybe because they were panicking. Borscht Dynamite should only be a combo tool, but when you're afraid, up and back is a lot faster to do than 2 back inputs. And once they start being afraid of you, a grappler has a much easier job getting back in. And grapplers are very good at holding space and standing their ground. Consistent anti-airs and longer than average buttons let them keep the opponent out while making their way in. But grappling comes with big downsides. The command grab is one of the most threatening options to have on offense, but it is also very risky for the grappler. Because if they manage to avoid it, command grabs have a lot of recovery, and generally, you'll end up getting hit with their biggest combo. You may force your opponent into an unfavored guessing scenario with huge upside if you manage to get the read, but you're getting punished equally hard if they had the read on you. They don't just instantly win once they get in command grab range. They still have to put themselves at massive risk to cash out. The grappler playstyle is all about high risk and even higher reward. Man, this part was a lot shorter. But what are the downsides that grapplers have to deal with in order to have this powerful offensive option? Generally, they aren't very good at actually getting in. Slow move speed, lack of movement options, and a general difficulty in launching their offense. This will be less of a challenge the less threatening your actual command grabs are. There are grapplers that don't have this weakness at all, but the traditional grappler will have challenges in getting in. It's harder for them to get in because it's a lot more rewarding for them once they do. Their strong buttons are good defensively, but don't really help push their offense. And this is why, generally speaking, zoners tend to beat grapplers in the direct matchup. The whole plan of the zoner is to keep you at this range, to keep you from getting in, and restricting your options, to force you to play their game. And grapplers are all about toughing through that initial struggle to cash out once they get in. The strength of the zoner directly exploits the weakness of the grappler, and the same goes with how these two playstyles deal with risk. The zoner is all about mitigating their risk and squeezing the most out of their advantageous position. On round start, all a zoner has to do is give up space, and now they're exactly where they want to be. Grapplers start out of range and have to work from the very start. What happens if a zoner gets a read right? An anti-air, a check, maybe a singular clean hit. Low risk, but not a whole lot of reward to complement it. But the grappler is almost the complete opposite. High risk in trying to get in, then high risk, high reward when cashing out on getting in. Two playstyles that are nearly opposite from one another. And that's the beauty of fighting games. I can't sit here and say objectively that either of these playstyles are better than the other. Something may be riskier, but it doesn't mean it's worse. A player that focuses on playing the game and making the right decision every time may thrive when playing a zoner, while a player focusing on hard reads and overwhelming your opponent, playing the player matchup, would love to play a grappler. I tackled these two characters as examples of these archetypes, but you have to realize that not every character will embody the archetype nearly as much. Some characters won't need to rely on their fireball as much, and others may need to heavily represent their fireball just to threaten the zoning. Certain grapplers may have stronger options to approach with, but don't have as rewarding of a command grab. And these two are far from the only common archetypes in the genre. Many more exist, and they push many different playstyles, each with varying amounts of risk-reward. I've spent this entire time talking about these archetypes and how they like to play, but don't take these as absolute law. Just because a character excels at one specific aspect of the game doesn't mean they are restricted to it. Zoning your opponent out doesn't make sense if they have a huge life lead. You need to take a risk. And if your opponent is on the back foot, it doesn't make sense to work so hard to get back in if you can just stop their attempt at a comeback. Depending on the state of the game, or even the player playing the character, a character can be utilized in vastly different ways. Dhalsim can use his teleport and slide to get in, and Zangief can zone out his opponents with his medium punch and kick. Even characters strong in one regard aren't one-dimensional. The optimal playstyle is hazy at best, and it does change from character to character, from second to second, and from player to player. Knowing when to deviate from your character's strengths is an important part of being a successful player. Your character's strengths should be your plan A, but don't let that stop you from swapping to plan B all the way to Z. A big part of fighting games is adaptability, and that might just mean adapting past your character. Know your character's strengths to formulate your initial game plan, but don't be afraid to move past it. These games have a vast array of characters. It's one of their best aspects. If a game has enough characters, chances are there is a character that fits everybody's playstyle. There is an endless list of archetypes that characters can be fit into, each with their own risks, rewards, tools, strengths, and weaknesses. And it's up to the developers of the game to make sure that every single player has a character that fits their playstyle. A game could be very fun, but if you don't have a character that fits you, it can always seem like something is missing. Something intangible. All of this to say, Capcom, please bring back Balrog. Shoot!